We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. H.P. Lovecraft, The Call of Cthulhu. When I was initially writing my Alien video essay, which has since become a massive success for this still growing channel, I capped the thing off at around 9,000 words, give or take some stuff that got left on the cutting room floor after recording. But some folks in the comments felt I could have expanded on my thoughts when it comes to Prometheus and Alien Covenant, and you know what? They were right. I did have more thoughts. Nuanced ones, even. So I thought it would be a good idea to dive further into these sequel prequels to ask the question of why an accomplished filmmaker like Ridley Scott, who helmed iconic films like Alien, Blade Runner, and The Martian, would churn out two pseudo-cosmic horror duds like Prometheus and Covenant. I mean, shouldn't he have been able to see that Prometheus was not fitting with the world he helped create in 1979, with the Lovecraftian horror that Dan O'Bannon's original script was focused on? I know, it's baffling because I have a ton of respect for Ridley Scott. How is it he didn't see the difference between the ancient astronaut-fueled pseudo-intellectual crap in Prometheus and actual cosmic horror? Well, to answer that question, we're going to need to take a look at what makes At the Mountains of Madness one of, if not my favorite stories by H.P. Lovecraft, scary. Why does it unnerve us? And what did the original Alien take from it? And to be clear, I'm not saying you can't like Prometheus or Covenant. If you find something you love in those films, great. I love that for you. But the videos on this channel are meant to be writing advice for people who might be interested in tackling the genres I love and also write in. So I'm not being negative for the sake of being negative. While that is certainly a trend on the internet, this is intended as constructive criticism. Ridley Scott is often described as being extremely blunt when talking to other creators about their work, his opinions, and whatnot. So in respect to him, I think it's only fair we extend the same courtesy. But because I don't want to be entirely negative in this video essay series, and because these videos are intended to be writing advice to those attempting to break into cosmic horror and new weird as a genre or genres, in the next video we'll look at ways we might be able to fix Prometheus, Covenant, and maybe even Alien 3 and Resurrection while we're at it. And I say next video because the script for this one would have been like 2 hours long with the extra content. But before we get to my thoughts and breakdowns of Prometheus and Covenant, unfortunately, we're also going to have to take a look at something else that clearly inspired Prometheus. And that's Eric von Daniken's Chariot of the Gods? No joke, it literally does have a question mark in the title. As well as the dumpster fire of a show known as Ancient Aliens, which has infested the History Channel like some kind of Shoggoth parasite. And we'll also be looking at the late-night radio program Coast to Coast AM, and how these things influence the general attitude towards the pseudoscience peddled by these works in the decade leading up to the production and release of Prometheus. I believe it's these ideas, hubris and the inclusion of hack writers like Damon Lindelof, who is known for working on Law, so, you know, that checks, that ultimately doomed Prometheus from the start. But could these films have been saved? Strap in, Space Cowboys, because we're about to get weird again. Now, after my initial video essay on Alien and its sequels, there were a few comments both here on YouTube and on Reddit claiming that Alien and even At the Mountains of Madness are not cosmic horror, if you can believe it, because they do not deal with outside cosmic forces unraveling humanity's understanding of its physical laws. But to me, that's an incredibly limited and rigid standard to define something as cosmic horror. A work in a genre does not need to exhibit every single trope in order to qualify. It may have several and exclude others so long as the themes are on point. You might be wondering what tropes, themes, and subject matter make up the genre versus generic sci-fi horror. According to Wikipedia, which samples from Lovecraft's own essay titled Supernatural Horror in Literature, cosmic horror may include the fear of the unknown and unknowable, the sense of terror and awe that humanity might feel when confronted with phenomena completely beyond our comprehension and whose scope extends beyond the narrow field of human sciences, our concerns, and the things that hint of cosmic significance. The horror derives from our realization that our morality, our laws, our desires, and interests have no meaning in the larger universe. Where the horror is derived from contemplating humanity's place in the vast, comfortless universe as it is revealed by modern science. In such cases, the horror is derived by revealing a so-called appalling truth, a naturalistic fusion of horror and science fiction in which presumptions about the nature of reality are eroded. that technological and social progress since classical times has facilitated the repression of an awareness of the magnitude and malignity of the macrocosm in which the human microcosm is contained, or in other words, a calculated repression of the horrifying nature of the cosmos as a reaction to its essential awfulness, having protagonists who are helpless in the face of unfathomable and inescapable powers, which reduces humans from a privileged position to insignificance and incompetence. Preoccupation with visceral textures, protein, semi-gelatinous substances, and slime, as opposed to the other horror elements such as blood, bones, and corpses.
If somebody blows their nose and you want to keep it.
Now, if you're like me and you've recently seen Alien, you're probably thinking the same thing I am, that the film matches quite a few criteria, especially in its themes. Now, we're not here to go back over Alien as a film, there's an hour-long video essay on the channel that already does that, but I figured this was a good aside to have, since there seemed to be a bit of confusion, especially on Reddit. Which, it's Reddit, so that's not surprising. It can be argued that the alien is a representation of the danger of the unknown, and of what happens when humanity ventures too far into the cold, unfeeling reaches of space. That, we weren't meant to voyage far. A lot of people who reject the notion that Alien is cosmic horror latch onto surface details and plot, rather than taking a look at the subtext the film offers us. This is a big problem with modern film analysis. These same people will sometimes point to a film like, say, Annihilation and claim that it is true cosmic horror, even though the themes and metaphors seem to be antithetical to the genre. Frankly, Dan O'Bannon was obsessed with Lovecraftian horror, and like a lot of horror directors and writers in the late 70s and early 80s, did his best to subtly inject his projects with Lovecraftian imagery and themes. You might wonder why the only true H.P. Lovecraft or pure Lovecraftian films that have been produced haven't been from the Hollywood machine. And that's because studios even today see weird fiction and Lovecraftian horror to be a giant risk, even when factoring in films like Alien and the eventual cult success of John Carpenter's The Thing into account. There are also those who will claim that Giger was never trying to emulate Lovecraft, and this claim is as silly as it is wrong. Giger admired Lovecraft and his brand of storytelling. In fact, that's pretty much why Dan O'Bannon, Ridley Scott, and Giger all got along so well. They had a shared inspiration. And yes, I will acknowledge that Ronald Shusett contributed to the original script along with a rewrite from Walter Hill that allegedly gave the film many of its most iconic elements, including the cyberpunk domineering company which drives so much of the plot in the first act. I say allegedly only because I haven't really had a chance to dig deep on this subject, but let me know if you'd like to see a video breaking down what each writer contributed to the film. And as you'll see later on in this video, while Alien does have inspirations from other primal myths and symbolism, and hell, I'd argue, what cosmic horror story doesn't, At the Mountains of Madness played a profound role in the development of Alien, and it's plain to see in the film. So yeah, Alien is in fact cosmic horror, and anyone who tells you otherwise is missing the forest for the goddamn trees. But more on that later. Now, we've got to talk about one of my least favorite topics in the known universe. That's right, ancient aliens. If you've never heard of Coast to Coast AM, allow me to educate you. Art Bell, the show's founder, was a pretty interesting guy, all things considered, who became a licensed amateur radio operator at the age of 13, and in the 1960s served in the U.S. Air Force. Bell operated a pirate radio station playing music for his entire base, something that was supported by his commander. But it was after his military service ended in 1966 that Bell became a dedicated disc jockey. He worked at several radio stations, and throughout his career he would be regarded as a master showman by the time he founded West Coast AM in 1988, a political talk radio show. And also, in 1988, Bell and a man named Alan Corberth rechristened the show to Coast AM. This saw Art Bell leaving the realm of political talk radio to venture into the spooky realm of speaking on topics deemed less savory in civilized conversation. You know, UFOs, the occult, conspiracy theories, and of course plenty of pseudoscience. Art Bell has gone on record stating he did not believe in the things his guests would talk about, but much like Joe Rogan in recent years, he did offer them a platform to speak freely from a position of authority, and many have speculated about the negative impact Coast to Coast AM and its imitators have had on society. This isn't a documentary on Coast to Coast AM, though, so we'll fast forward to the modern era, especially in the early 2000s when many of the ideas that would come to influence the production of Prometheus became most popular. Shows like Coast to Coast AM provided a platform for those who were fully invested in the so-called ancient astronaut theory to speak on and propagate it, regardless of the shaky ground it stood on. Eventually, the idea was popular enough for it to get its own quote-unquote documentary, which aired on the History Channel, of all things. This pseudo-documentary made-for-TV movie was rerun many times on the channel before the Ancient Aliens TV series most of us are at least partially familiar with was greenlit and released. It's kind of wild to think that H2, formerly History International, regarded this show as its flagship title. And fast-forwarding to the modern era, History Channel itself has been overtaken with sensationalistic programming about skinwalkers, UFO hunters, Bigfoot, and so on, with Ancient Aliens leading the pack. Many of my own friends and family were swept up by these programs, thinking that the History Channel gave the show a lot of credibility. And it's probably no accident that this is the case. And I wasn't immune to this either, and admittedly there is something cool about the idea that aliens might have influenced our ancient cultures. I mean, that's at least one part of what drew me to Lovecraftian horror, but the show often blatantly lies about the so-called evidence it presents to the viewer. Something you can only see once you've grown up and gotten an actual education. There's an episode of the show that claims that dinosaur species like T-Rex and Triceratops were brought to extinction by aliens. Yeah, there's a lot wrong with Ancient Aliens, and if we were to try to counter every single brain-dead claim made by the show, we'd be here all fucking day. And I'm not gonna do that to you. This technique of bombarding someone with more crap than is available at a McDonald's drive-thru so they can't make heads or tails of what to refute first is called Gish galloping, named after young Earth creationist Duane Gish. Gish would interrupt pretty much any lecture on evolution with the equivalent of a dump truck of misinformation and misunderstandings about the theory of evolution in an effort to confuse his opponents. This has actually led to a lot of general misinformation about the theory of evolution in the public consciousness. Erroneous questions like,
if we evolved from monkeys, why aren't there still monkeys?
The answer being quite simple. A, we evolved from an ape ancestor. We're apes, not monkeys. And B, natural selection, as far as we know, does not seek to do things with anything resembling a purpose. It's not a sapient force. What it does do is allow organisms to adapt to their environment to help them fill niches and make them more likely to be able to survive and pass on their genes. If humans and other ape species occupy different niches in their respective environments, there's no reason for either to be eliminated. The Earth is a lot bigger than most people think. There's also the popular idea that somehow human beings will evolve greater and greater intelligence, something that we sometimes see in science fiction movies and shows like the Planet of the Apes series and Star Trek TOS. But that's not how evolution works. Darwin said that intelligence differs in degree, not in kind. And humans have a bad habit of thinking that they're the hottest shit around, even though there are several species that seem like they could eventually be on our level. We almost categorically ignore the intellectual feats of other animals like octopi, orcas, dolphins, and even other species of apes, when they are a direct example of nature filling other niches that we have not. And often science fiction blurs the line between what is sentient, a term that means for an animal to be able to perceive its environment and express basic desires and emotions, and sapience, the ability to ponder one's own existence, i.e. self-awareness. I'd argue that there are plenty of humans on this planet that aren't self-aware. Okay, so Ancient Aliens slowly invaded our popular culture throughout the 2010s and eventually started pushing its insidious tendrils into the minds of scriptwriters, which is something that Ridley Scott has been very interested in. He was even set to direct a series called Pharaoh, which was supposed to explore the rise of Egypt and the influence of extraterrestrials on our species. But as far as I know, the show never saw the light of day. But it's clear to see that Ancient Aliens were on his mind when he made Prometheus. I believe it's this influence on Ridley Scott and his team that doomed Prometheus before the first frame was ever shot. Because, as you'll find out in the next section, the philosophy behind the pseudoscience of Ancient Aliens is antithetical to the themes explored in cosmic horror. It seeks to put humanity on a pedestal, suggesting that mankind is special, that we have been favored by the gods that inspired our religion. And if you know anything about cosmic horror, you know that humanity is anything but special. At At the Mountains of Madness by H.P. Lovecraft is a seminal work in the genre of cosmic horror. It follows Dr. William Dyer of Miskatonic University as he retells the events that led to the loss of several of his men and the horrifying discoveries they made during an Antarctic investigation. Or, in other words, it's about a scientific investigation set in Antarctica gone horribly wrong. Hell yeah, ice horror, baby. But more importantly, At the Mountains of Madness is about unraveling humanity's understanding of deep time, or the picture we have of Earth's 4.5 billion year history, our fossil record, and potentially our very understanding of reality itself. It's about learning hidden truths about science and our world that we aren't ready for, truths that can drive us mad. Also, it has a Shoggoth. Seriously, At the Mountains of Madness is still one of my favorite H.P. Lovecraft stories. And it's a crime against art that it hasn't been adapted into film. Yes, I'm still mad that Guillermo del Toro didn't get to make his At the Mountains of Madness film because of Prometheus's perceived failure, and every time I bring up Prometheus, I will remind you of that fact. Speaking of the devil, the film Prometheus shares direct similarities with At the Mountains of Madness, something I briefly touched on in my previous essay on Alien and its sequels. So, for this section of the video, I'll be comparing key scenes in the novella to Prometheus, as well as explaining which parts of Prometheus are inspired by the Ancient Aliens conspiracy theory and why that was a terrible idea on the part of Ridley Scott, John Spates, and Damon Lindelof. The opening to Prometheus presents us with an establishing shot of a green and lush world. We see a tall, white being walking alongside a flowing river. Upon closer inspection, this being is remarkably human. Its skin is pale and its eyes are black. It removes a small device from its cloak and opens it to reveal a black substance. The creature drinks the substance and shortly collapses in pain. Its body falls into the river where it is broken down into DNA strands that spread through the river, presumably creating life. All this time, an alien ship has been floating above the land, much in the way that rocks don't, watching this event unfold. With the act done, the ship leaves the atmosphere and the title is revealed. In the next scene, we're introduced to the main characters of the film. Elizabeth Shaw and Charlie Holloway, two archaeologists working to uncover the origins of humanity. They uncover this cave art in Scotland that depicts a constellation that Shaw and Holloway interpret as an invitation. This star map is also similar to others found in archaeological sites around the world from cultures that supposedly had no contact with one another. An invitation? By whom, you might ask? Why, the creators of the human species, of course. This discovery attracts funding from mega corporation Weyland-Yutani, and Shaw and Holloway and a host of other scientists are put on a ship and sent, and I quote, 500 million miles away from the Earth to an alien planet. Yeah, you heard me right. At one point, Charlize Theron's character Meredith Vickers actually says this. As an aside, please note that 500 million miles is basically equivalent to how far away Jupiter is from the Earth, one of the many research flubs in this film. But anyway, the opening act of the film is spent on the ship, on the way to a planet called LV-223. The ship's crew is all kept in suspended animation while David, a Weyland-Yutani android, learns to speak a dead language. The crew eventually comes out of cold sleep and the ship descends to the surface of LV-223, where a team led by Shaw and Holloway and a bunch of other quote-unquote scientists, who are more plot devices than characters, don their spacesuits and travel in some admittedly rad-looking rovers to a Giger-esque, read more like Giger-light-looking temple on this alien world. Inside, they make several blunders, such as taking off their helmets because the air appears to be quote-unquote breathable. Which, as a fan of science and hard science fiction, I find this laughable. While the original Alien and its sequel, Aliens, wasn't trying to be realistic, the nature of filmmaking back then was to try to make everything on screen feel as believable and real as possible. The result were two films that feel surprisingly realistic, and allow most viewers to suspend their disbelief without much effort. Side tangent. It's often said that if alien life exists, then any virus and infections evolved on that world would likely not be able to infect us here on Earth because of incompatible biology. But this isn't that, it's the exact opposite. Another reason why it feels like the writers of Prometheus were just winging it, refusing to do any research at all. But, and hear me out, why would a bunch of scientists who believe that they've found a hidden temple belonging to their creators not adhere to quarantine procedures? I mean, Ripley certainly understood quarantine procedures in Alien, and given the supposed relationship to humanity these ruins represented, wouldn't there be an increased risk for bacteria, viruses, and some wholly unknown organism here? Moving on. They also attempt to map the temple structure out using these laser drones that are also admittedly fucking rad. The team discovers the remnants of a bastardized space jockey and two of the plot devices, supposedly a biologist and geologist, get spooked and run off where they will inevitably get lost because the plot demands it. David, the totally not evil android, opens the door that severed the bastardized space jockey's head from his shoulders and reveals a room filled with black jars filled with the same black goo we saw in the beginning of the film. The room's ceiling is a mural complete with what looks like a xenomorph at its focal point. It's eventually revealed that a storm is about to hit the temple and that the team won't be able to get back to the ship if they don't leave right that second. David steals some space spooge. Shaw and Holloway grab the engineer's head, and everyone besides the two plot devices books it back to the Prometheus, the name of the ship, by the way. Back at the ship, the team analyzes the alien head, and it explodes when they attempt to bring it back to life. Whatever. It's discovered that the engineer head's DNA matches our own, and David slips Holloway a Mickey. And then Holloway and Shaw get it on after being more than slightly insufferable. In my opinion, this is where Act 1 ends. Either that, or I need a break from reciting what happens in this film. You decide. Let's talk about the first act of At the Mountains of Madness, then. At the Mountains of Madness is written as a long, multi-part letter meant to discourage any further investigation into the Antarctic continent and an impending expedition set to explore the continent further. Dr. Dyer is very reluctant to retell the portions of the story that he hasn't blocked out, and much of it feels like a mad fever dream. The opening chapter is spent establishing Dr. Dyer's mission, their equipment, and detailing their findings using an incredible new drill developed by one of his colleagues. It's in these opening pages, which are being represented on screen by the manga panels from the excellent manga adaptation by Go Tanabe, that we get our first description of this otherworldly piping sound, a howling that will be referenced multiple times in this story and should be quite familiar to fans of the original Alien film, as it's a sound that permeates the sound design and score, and that is no accident. Dyer also constantly relates the scenery of the Antarctic to Nicholas Roerich paintings, and this artist's work will continually be referenced throughout the novella. He also uses references to the Necronomicon and the Plateau of Lang, a fictional mythological location that breeds dread into the mind of Dr. Dyer, and is meant to prepare us to have the serene paintings of Nicholas Roerich and all the mental imagery it provides corrupted later on. The Doctor notes various fairly normal fossils we might find in the ice before revealing something out of the ordinary, a triangular piece of slate broken into 3 parts. Dr. Dyer tells us that one of his colleagues, Lake, is becoming obsessed with this Precambrian specimen, claiming that the markings in its surface are clearly from an unknown life form. But Dyer dismisses this possibility, suggesting that these striated depressions in the slate were more than likely caused by geological processes. Also in these early pages, Dyer tells us of a possible polar mirage as he describes their journey to their initial camp. Distant mountains floated in the sky as enchanted cities, and often the whole white world would dissolve into a gold, silver, and scarlet land of Dunsanian dreams, and adventurous expectancy under the magic of the low midnight sun. Later on, Dyer will again refer to Lake's growing obsession with the pieces of slate featuring the striated markings, stating that Lake was insisting he be able to take 4 planes, many men, and all of the mechanical tools the expedition had to offer and move northwestward. Lake basically mutinies as Dyer complains about his obsession, mentioning that the specimens could not possibly be evidence of complex life because of their Cambrian, if not Precambrian, origin. And if you know anything about deep time, you know that the Precambrian era consisted of early lifeforms, soft-bodied animals like worms and jellyfish in the oceans, and barren landmasses. Complex life like us had yet to evolve. This was 541 to 485 million years ago, and Dyer notes that these slate fragments could even be a billion years old. Throughout the second chapter, it's becoming kind of clear that Lake is being driven by a mad fervor. But then Lake starts sending messages to Dyer, giving us our first true description of those mountains of madness. 10:05 p.m. On the wing, after snowstorm, have spied mountain range ahead higher than any hitherto seen. May equal Himalayas, allowing for height of plateau. Probable latitude 76 degrees 16 feet. Longitude 113 degrees 10 feet east. Reach as far as can see to right and left. Suspicion of 2 smoking cones. All peaks black and bare of snow. Gale blowing off them impedes navigation. Molten's plane forced down on plateau and foothills, but nobody hurt and perhaps can repair. Shall transfer essentials to other 3 for return or further moves if necessary, but no more heavy plane travel needed just now. Mountains surpass anything in imagination. Am going up scouting in Carol's plane with all weight out. You can't imagine anything like this. Highest peaks must go over 35,000 feet. Everest, out of the running. Atwood to work out height with Theodolite while Carol and I go up. Probably wrong about cones, for formations look stratified. Possibly Precambrian slate with other strata mixed in. Queer skyline effects, regular sections of cubes clinging to highest peaks. Whole thing marvelous in red gold light of low sun. Like land of mystery in a dream or gateway to forbidden world of untrodden wonder. Wish you were here to study. Up with Carol over highest foothills. Don't dare try really tall peaks in present weather, but shall later. Frightful work climbing, and hard going at this altitude, but worth it. Great range fairly solid, hence can't get any glimpses beyond. Main summits exceed Himalayas, and very queer. Range looks like Precambrian slate, with plain signs of many other upheaved strata. Was wrong about volcanism. Goes further in either direction than we can see. Swept clear of snow above 21,000 feet. Odd formations on slopes of highest mountains. Great low square blocks with exactly vertical sides, and rectangular lines of low vertical ramparts like the old Asian castles clinging to steep mountains in Roerich paintings. Impressive from distance. Flew close to some, and Carol thought they were formed of smaller, separate pieces, but that is probably weathering. Most edges crumbled and rounded off as if exposed to storms and climate changes for millions of years. Parts, especially upper parts, seem to be of lighter colored rock than any visible strata on slopes proper, hence of evidently crystalline origin. Close flying shows many cave mouths, some unusually regular in outline, square or semicircular. You must come and investigate. Think I saw ramparts squarely on top of one peak. Height seems about 30,000 to 35,000 feet. Am up 21,500 myself in devilish gnawing cold. Wind whistles and pipes through passes and in and out of caves, but no flying danger so far. As you can tell, we're getting our first hazy glimpses of the structures that populate the Mountains of Madness. But even Lake, in his mad fervor to uncover the unknowable, does not acknowledge them as anything other than natural formations. Fast forward to when Lake begins his blasting and drilling. His team discovers a strange cave. Its contents and its composition seem to be filled with fossils from 300 to 30 million years ago. Dyer tells us he assumed a cataclysm must have wiped those simpler life forms out, denying that they could be from the same time period. Fowler makes discovery of highest importance in sandstone and limestone fragments from blasts, several distinct triangular striated prints like those in Archean slate, proving that source survived from over 600 million years ago to Comanchean times without more than moderate morphological changes and decrease in average size. Comanchean prints apparently more primitive or decadent, if anything, than older ones. Emphasize importance of discovery in press. Will mean to biology what Einstein has meant to mathematics and physics. Joins up with my previous work and amplifies conclusions. Appears to indicate, as I suspected, that the Earth has been whole cycle or cycles of organic life before known one that begins with Archaeozoic cells. Was evolved and specialized not later than 1,000 million years ago, when planet was young and recently uninhabitable for any life forms or normal protoplasmic structure. Question arises when, where, and how development took place. Later. Examining certain skeletal fragments of large land and marine saurians and primitive mammals, find singular local wounds or injuries to bony structures not attributable to any known predatory or carnivorous animal of any period of two sorts. Straight, penetrant bores and apparently hacking incisions. One or two cases of cleanly severed bone. Not many specimens affected. Am sending to camp for electrical torches. Will extend search area underground by hacking away stalactites. Still later. Have found peculiar soapstone fragments about 6 inches across and 1.5 inches thick, wholly unlike any visible local formation. Greenish, but no evidences to place its period. Has curious smoothness and regularity. Shaped like 5-pointed star with tips broken off. and signs of other cleavage at inward angles and in center of surface, small, smooth depressions in center of unbroken surface, arouses much curiosity as to source and weathering, probably some freak of water action. Carroll, with magnifier, thinks he can make out additional markings of geological significance, groups of tiny dots in regular patterns. Dogs growing uneasy as we work, and seem to hate this soapstone. Must see if it has any peculiar odor. Will report again when Mills gets back with light and we start on underground area. 10:15 p.m. Important discovery. Orendorff and Watkins, working underground at 9:45 with light, found monstrous barrel-shaped fossil of wholly unknown nature. Probably vegetable unless overgrown specimen of unknown marine radiata. Tissue evidently preserved by mineral salts. Tough as leather, but astonishingly flexible in places. Marks of broken off parts at ends and around sides. 6 feet end to end, 3 5/10 feet central diameter, tapering to 1 foot at each end, like a barrel with 5 bulging ridges in place of staves. Lateral breakages as of thinnish stalks are at equator in middle of these ridges. In furrows between ridges are curious growths, combs or wings that fold up and spread out like fans. All greatly damaged but one, which gives almost 7-foot wing spread. Arrangement reminds one of certain monsters of primal myth, especially fabled elder things in Necronomicon. Their wings seem to be membranous, stretched on framework of glandular tubing. Apparent minute orifices in frame tubing at wingtips, ends of body shriveled, giving no clue to interior or to what has been broken off there. Must dissect when we get back to camp. Can't decide whether vegetable or animal. Many features obviously of almost incredible primitiveness. Have set all hands cutting stalactites and looking for further specimens. Additional scarred bones found, but these must wait. Having trouble with dogs. They can't endure the new specimen, and would probably tear it to pieces if we didn't keep it at a distance from them. Lake continues urging Dyer to send messages to the mainland to alert of his immense discovery, for this strange barrel-shaped fossil was the same one that made the strange striated prints in the slate they discovered earlier in the story. He also mentions that deeper in the cave system, he and his team discovered a cluster of 14 of these things, frozen by the elements. Of these new specimens, 8 appear to be perfect, and he tells Dyer that he and his team have dragged these 8 back to his camp for further study. But his plan to dissect the animals does not go as intended, as their composition is much tougher than he initially thought. But one of the specimens brought back was apparently wounded and is oozing a strange green substance he thinks might work similar to blood. Dyer notes that existing biology would have to be wholly revised, for this thing was no byproduct of any cell growth science knows about. Or in other words, these creatures defy our scientific knowledge for how biology should work. However, as Lake and his team are about to give themselves some much-needed rest, news comes in about a storm that is more than likely going to hit both camps. Foreshadowing much? When that storm clears and Dyer and his team goes to investigate why Lake isn't answering the radio, they set upon a horrific discovery. Lake and his entire camp, dogs included, have been slaughtered. The storm is still raging, and our 2 plot devices are stuck hanging out inside the alien temple. One of them is smoking a big fat doobie inside his suit, which would kind of be awesome if this character was an actual character and not a random collection of traits intended to move the plot forward. They notice something slithering around in the water, a strange snake-like organism that the biologist, who, as you recall, was freaked out by the alien bodies earlier and wanted to GTFO, finds immensely fascinating. He tries to tame this thing and ends up dead in a proto-facehugger moment that is admittedly very nicely realized with VFX. A shame it's not in a better film. The other plot device is also killed by our snake friend by spraying him with an acidic substance in a callback or call forward to the acid blood we all know and love. When David and the others return to the alien structure, they discover a control room with a surviving engineer in suspended animation similar to Weyland-Yutani's cold sleep tech. Holloway gets sick and his condition gets worse on his trip back to the Prometheus. Meredith Vickers refuses to let Holloway get back on the ship. Oh, now they want to observe quarantine procedures. Fuck you, movie. Holloway's sickness progresses to the point that he becomes a weird black goo zombie and has to be torched to death. Later, it's revealed that Dr. Shaw is pregnant. I didn't mention it before, but it was previously established that she couldn't get pregnant. But she is not carrying Holloway's baby, at least not in the traditional sense. And she seems to know that something is very wrong with this pregnancy and makes her way through the ship to use an automated surgical table she found earlier in the film that also seems to be calibrated only for the male persuasion. After some reprogramming, Shaw is able to extract what looks like a squid of some kind from her belly before it rapidly grows to a monstrous size. Honestly, besides the weird stapling she does to her abdomen and the fact that she'd be totally unable to move after this procedure, this sequence is still pretty great. Again, it's too bad it's not in a better film. Shaw, as she's stumbling around the ship, runs into none other than Weyland-Yutani himself with some terrible age makeup, and the rest of the crew as they gear up to go back to the alien complex and revive their sleeping engineer friend, beginning Act 3. Once the storm clears, Dyer and his team make their way over to Lake's camp by plane, and in the process, Dyer is forced to witness those mountains of madness for himself. This mood undoubtedly served to aggravate my reaction to the bizarre mirage, which burst upon us from the increasingly opalescent zenith as we drew near the mountains and begun to make out the cumulative undulations of the foothills. I had seen dozens of polar mirages during the preceding weeks, some of them quite as uncanny and fantastically vivid as the present example. But this one had a wholly novel and obscure quality of menacing symbolism, and I shuddered as the seething labyrinth of fabulous walls and towers and minarets loomed out of the troubled ice vapors above our heads, with vast aggregations of night-black masonry embodying monstrous perversions of geometric laws. There were truncated cones, sometimes terraced or fluted, surmounted by tall cylindrical shafts here and there bulbously enlarged and often capped with tiers of thinnish scalloped discs, and strange beetling table-like constructions suggesting piles of multitudinous rectangular slabs or circular plates of five-pointed stars with each one overlapping the one beneath. There were composite cones and pyramids either alone or surmounting cylinders or cubes, or flatter truncated cones and pyramids, and occasional needle-like spires in curious clusters of 5. All of these febrile structures seemed knit together by tubular bridges crossing from one to the other at various dizzy heights, and the implied scale of the whole was terrifying and oppressive in its sheer gigantism. The general type of mirage was not unlike some of the wilder forms observed and drawn by the Arctic whaler Scoresbian 1820. But at this time and place, with those dark, unknown mountain peaks soaring stupendously ahead, that anomalous elder world discovery in our minds, and the pall of probable disaster enveloping the greater part of our expedition, we all seemed to find in it a taint of latent malignity and infinitely evil portent. When Dyer and his crew find Lake's camp, they discover that almost everyone is dead, save for Gennady and one of the dogs. They notice that there are now 6 star-shaped mounds of snow, each of them containing one of the specimens mentioned in Lake's messages. They also notice that Lake and the others weren't just killed, they were dissected. It's assumed that Gennady must have lost his freaking marbles and was the one behind the murders and dissections. Dyer and Danforth set off toward those titular mountains of madness in a plane, hoping to salvage the operation. As they draw closer to them, the two men are floored by what they see, describing their reaction as crying out in mixed awe, wonder, terror, and disbelief at our own senses. But even these are inadequate to describe the awe and ancient beauty of what they see. Dyer and Danforth eventually find a place to land their plane within the ruins and begin exploring them, beginning the third and final act of the novella. When Weyland-Yutani and David, with Shaw brought along for the ride, revive this engineer from cold sleep, Weyland asks the engineer, using David's mastery of Indo-European, the dead language he was studying earlier in the film, to give him the secret of eternal life. Shaw protests, wanting to ask her own questions, and seeing the violence that Weyland and his people inflict on Shaw seems to trigger a violent response in the engineer. In the theatrical cut of the film, there is no dialogue from the engineer as David translates Wayland's questions in a somewhat unfaithful manner. But the Blu-ray of Prometheus reveals an entire conversation between David and the engineer that was cut from the film, essentially boiling down to the engineer not liking violence and ranting at David that they gave us space Jesus and civilization and we squandered it all. This, by the way, is the intent behind the presence of the engineers and is the biggest reason why Prometheus falls flat on its face. More on that later, though. The revived engineer kills Wayland and rips off David's head and begins the process of reactivating this film's version of a space jockey ship, with the intent to kill all life on Earth. Shaw flees the space jockey ship, but not before warning Jonik, played by Idris Elba, of the engineer's intent. The remaining crew of the Prometheus sacrifice their lives by crashing the ship into the space jockey ship. This all leads to one of the dumbest sequences in the film, where Shaw and Vickers run away from the crashing space jockey ship, where Shaw narrowly escapes being crushed, despite the fact she could have just moved perpendicularly from the craft and Vickers gets squished. After this, Shaw finds the lifeboat and the engineer tracks her down and tries to kill her, but the engineer is ultimately killed by Shaw's baby/gigantic alien squid monster acting like a massive facehugger. The end of the film sees Shaw pick up David's head and, with his help, finds another space jockey ship. The two of them take off for the engineer homeworld, and the credits roll. Except, psych! A second ending reveals something bursting from the chest of the dead engineer in the lifeboat. As Dyer and Danforth explore the alien ruins within those mountains of madness, Dyer begins to refer to them as Elder Things, or Great Old Ones. Really, the two terms are somewhat confusingly used interchangeably throughout the novella, due to their similarities to things he read in the dreaded Necronomicon. With nothing but the light trickling in from the way they came and electric torches to light their way in the labyrinthine dark, they discover great sprawling murals depicting the apparent history of these Elder Things, spanning many strange eons. They describe the Elder Things' descent from the depths of space to the young Earth, their conflict with the starspawn of Cthulhu, the Mi-Go, and their eventual creation and subjugation of a strange, amorphous, shape-shifting lifeform known as Shoggoth. The Shoggoth were essentially slaves, and were also used as tools to build the Elder Things' great civilization. But they eventually revolted against their creators, tearing down the very civilization they were forced to build. I'm staunchly pro-Shoggoth, by the way. Throughout this investigation, Dyer and Danforth are scrambling to illustrate as much of these murals and markings as they possibly can, sketching them on pieces of paper. But what is curious about this process is that the text is pretty specific about how quiet they are. There is always an underlying dread as to what might be lurking in the depths of those ruins, and this is directly contrasted with their mad, feverish need to know more. I'll further note that Alien understands this, and it's why the space jockey exploration sequence is so damn quiet and haunting, because there is always the underlying fear that the characters might not be alone. Contrast this with Prometheus's clumsy and bombastic exploration of the engineer ruins, and you begin to see the problems with it. More on this later. At some point, Dyer and Danforth get so deep into the ruins that they lose the natural light source that they were using as a lifeline back to the surface. The light served as much as a means of seeing the murals as it did as a comfort. Now, though, all Dyer and Danforth have are electric torches to guide them. The murals depict the gradual degradation of the Elder Things' sprawling society after the revolt of the Shoggoth, and suggest that something evil may be lurking in an even more massive mountain range lurking beyond the city. These even more maddening mountains of madness came into existence in a single night. The Elder Things refused to explore it. Furthermore, the allusions to this quote-unquote evil in those even more mad mountains of madness beyond this city suggest that the place defies known physics, and it's implied in the text that they are not always visible or even accessible. I am not as skeptical about the old tales and fears as I used to be, and I do not laugh now at the pre-human sculptor's notion that lightning paused meaningfully now and then at each of the brooding crests, and that an unexplained glow shone from one of those terrible pinnacles all through the long polar night. There may be a very real and very monstrous meaning in the old Nakadic whispers about Kadath in the cold waste. Soon, though, Antarctica became a hostile environment for the Elder Things, and they retreated to the depths of the ocean, and eventually lost their ability to travel through space. This eventually leads Dyer and Danforth to conclude that the majority of the Elder Things' great cities were eventually swept away, leaving no evidence behind. The two men are shocked to find several sketchbooks and other items from Lake's camp with curious markings on them. At first, Dyer and Danforth believe that poor departed Gedney is the one who made the markings in the sketchbook, but they are eventually confronted with the indisputable fact that it could not have been him. But what the art-blind burglar could never have done was to execute those sketches in a strange and assured technique, perhaps superior despite hate and carelessness to any of the decadent carvings from which they were taken. The characteristic and unmistakable technique of the Old Ones themselves in the Dead City's heyday. And upon discovering the corpses of Gedney and the lost dog, it's revealed to Dyer and Danforth that it was not the crazed, unfortunate Gedney that slaughtered Lake's camp, but a revived member of the Elder Things' species, perfectly preserved in the ice among its dead brethren. And it's thought that like these ancient beings, humanity's society and cities will suffer the same fate. A chilling thought, no? Ultimately, they are drawn to a tunnel entrance, in an even deeper part of the labyrinth. In this place, they find signs of a struggle, where Elder Things were slaughtered. They also find these 2-meter-tall blind albino penguins, which they surmise may have been used as some kind of livestock at some point. As they move further and further into the tunnel, they begin to notice that the floor is smooth and has an almost greasy quality to it. They also note that there are murals down here too, only these are crude, almost as if they're a mockery of the ones in the upper portions of the city. Then, Dyer and Danforth are stopped by what appears to be a massive wall of bubbling black liquid, the terrifying presence of those mythic Shoggoth. Formless protoplasm able to mock and reflect all forms and organs and processes, viscous agglutinations of bubbling cells, rubbery 15-foot spheroids infinitely plastic and ductile. More and more sullen, more and more intelligent, more and more amphibious, more and more imitative. Great God! What madness made even those blasphemous Old Ones willing to use and carve such things? What madness made even those blasphemous Old Ones willing to use and carve such things? And like a pissed-off subway car, the Shoggoth gives chase through the tunnel. Dyer and Danforth flee. When they finally manage to get to safety, Dyer notes, "By of that entity we had formed a clear idea. What we did see, for the mists were indeed all too malignly thinned, was seemingly altogether different and immeasurably more hideous and detestable. It was the utter, objective embodiment of the fantastic novelist's thing that should not be, and its nearest comprehensible analog is a vast, onrushing subway train as one sees it from a station platform, the great black front looming colossally out of infinite subterranean distance, constellated with strange colored lights and filling the prodigious burrow as a piston fills a cylinder. And it was a terrible, indescribable thing vaster than any subway train, a shapeless congeries of protoplasmic bubbles, faintly self-luminous and with myriads of temporary eyes forming and unforming as pustules of greenish light all over the tunnel-filling front that bore down upon us, crushing the frantic penguins and slithering over the glistening floor that it and its kind had swept so evilly free of all litter. Still came that eldritch, mocking cry, Tekalili, Tekalili. Yeah, I fucking love Shoggoths. At one point, Dyer breaks down and laments the demise of the Elder Things at the hands of the Shoggoth, crying out, "They were men, they were men." Dyer and Danforth manage to flee from the ruins of the Elder Things' city and get in the plane flying away from that hellish place. But unfortunately for Danforth, as Dyer is distracted flying them to safety, he gets one massive eyeful of something that makes him scream with terror. If you've ever played Call of Cthulhu, this would be the onset of a permanent bout of madness. Dyer notes, "For this far-off violet line could be nothing else than the terrible mountains of the Forbidden Land, highest of Earth's peaks and focus of Earth's evil, harborers of nameless horrors and Archean secrets, shunned and prayed to by those who feared to carve their meaning, untrodden by any living thing on earth, but visited by the sinister lightings and sending strange beams across the plains in the polar night. Beyond doubt, the unknown archetype of that dreaded Kadath in the cold waste, beyond abhorrent Lang, whereof primal legends hint evasively." The cosmic terror that ended the Elder Things' time in the Antarctic city is never shown, never named, but reading between the lines paints an unknown unknown that is so terrible even the Elder Things refuse to depict it. Dyer continues with, "All that Danforth has ever hinted at is that the final horror was a mirage. It was not, he declares, anything connected with the cubes and caves of those echoing, vaporous, wormly honeycombed mountains of madness which we crossed, but a single fantastic demoniac glimpse among the churning zenith clouds of what lay back of those other violet westward mountains which the old ones had shunned and feared. It is very probable that the thing was a sheer delusion born of the previous stresses we had passed through, and of the actual, though unrecognized, mirage the dead transmontane city experienced near Lake's camp the day before. But it was so real to Danforth that he suffers from it still." And with that, Dyer and a raving mad Danforth fly back to safety, and the story ends. If you haven't read At the Mountains of Madness, I think you should, especially if you're a big Alien fan. As you can no doubt tell, much of the original film was inspired by it. As you can probably see by the comparison of these two works, Prometheus confuses the themes at work in At the Mountains of Madness. It wants to be a thought-provoking cosmic horror film, but fails to understand why cosmic horror is cosmic horror. While it's true that the Elder Things are thought to have accidentally created humanity during their time on Earth, the vastness of Lovecraft's universe is never brought into question. We get the full sense that we are seeing an extremely small part of the mystery of deep time on Earth revealed to us for the first time, rewriting our history and origins and defying the laws of nature in the process. Prometheus, however, makes the mistake of making humanity's connection to these so-called engineers too clear. This is one of the tendencies in modern films that I really dislike, this incessant need to tie everything together in a neat bow to explain every little nuance of a universe or creature's origins. It makes the Alien universe feel small, and as a result far less dangerous than it did in the first two films. When comparing At the Mountains of Madness to Prometheus and Alien, the Alien could be seen as analogous to the Shoggoth in the space jockey in Alien, and the engineers in Prometheus analogous to the Elder Things. But Lovecraft understands that it's important to keep these creatures firmly within the uncanny valley, giving them plant-like and organic features that seem to defy logic, even if later Dyer believes they are also very similar to humans. And guess what? Alien understands this too. The space jockey is a huge mystery, even more so than the Elder Things, because it takes up such a small part of the story. But Prometheus makes the mistake of making them too human. One of my favorite things about the Elder Things is that they will often, when encountering humans, just drag them off and dissect them, as seen in the first act of At the Mountains of Madness and other fictional works featuring them. They aren't empathetic to human needs or desires. They don't give a flying fuck about us. Yet the engineers in Prometheus do. In an older script, there was actual dialogue where the engineers complained about all of humanity squandering all the gifts they gave us, including fucking Space Jesus. This would be fine for any other subgenre of science fiction. Hell, you could make the case for a good sci-fi horror movie messing with Christian mythology effectively, but that's not what Prometheus set out to do. And it flies in the face of Alien's established themes. Remember when I called out how Dyer and Danforth's exploration of the ruins in At the Mountains of Madness is done in complete silence, and Prometheus's exploration of its own alien ruins are bombastic and clumsy? I'm honestly at a loss as to why the decision was made for these scenes to be so loud. The original Alien understands this. This seems to be another overall problem with modern big-budget films, the expectation being that the audience's attention span is garbage. Thanks, TikTok. And this somehow means that atmospheric horror flicks will somehow never do well with modern audiences. And I think that's bullshit. My nephew was like 16 when he first saw Alien, and he loved every minute of it. And it takes a lot to hold his interest in something. I don't necessarily think that attention spans across the board are decreasing. Yes, some of this is happening with shorts and TikTok videos, but we're also seeing longer form content thrive on streaming and on YouTube, where someone like H-Bomber Guy can drop a 4-hour video on Roblox or some shit and people will watch the fuck out of it. I think the real problem is that there's just way too much garbage media to sift through. Every studio is looking for that next big IP, or they're busy beating other IPs to death with an endless parade of reboots and prequels and streaming shows, while continuing to fundamentally misunderstand what made the original films or shows or comics in that franchise great in the first place. I mean, think about it. This year alone, we've seen several films hit it big at the box office, when just a few months ago, people were decrying the end of movie theaters. TLDR, Prometheus is ancient alien garbage. It's a bad adaptation of At the Mountains of Madness. It's bad cosmic horror. The end. But what about Alien Covenant? If Prometheus makes all these mistakes, certainly Covenant can't make the world of Alien feel any smaller, right? Right? Alien Covenant is a strange film. In response to what the studio perceived as a disappointment with critics and the meager box office success of Prometheus, Ridley Scott returned to helm yet another prequel in the Alien franchise, abandoning some of his plans for the follow-up to the previous film in favor of more xenomorph action. And the result was a pseudo-sequel to Prometheus that once again attempted to explain the origins of the xenomorph. While the opening scene is mostly fine, the ancient alien, almost creationist-style ramblings of Weyland-Yutani unfortunately set the tone for what's to come. Alien Covenant's story revolves around a damaged Weyland-Yutani colony ship that intercepts a transmission from an uncharted world, only to stumble upon the last survivor of the Prometheus and the virus introduced in the film holding its namesake. One of the bigger complaints I have about the film is that the writing for these characters is like paper thin. The performances are mostly fine, but much like Prometheus, most of these characters don't feel like real people. The original Alien was a masterclass in how to establish a ship full of characters through the use of natural conversations. You know, things these blue-collar workers would actually talk about. Because of this, we get little windows into the lives of the crew of the Nostromo before shit hits the fan. But Covenant doesn't do that. And while the ship being damaged is a decent hook, but totally scientifically inaccurate for the story and making this other world seem enticing, more could have been done in the screenplay to make us care about these people. The movie needed to establish a reason to care about Daniels, other than the fact that her husband just died. We get a lot of melodrama, but little in the way of information about these characters. A good moment to do this would have been the funeral, but it's undercut by Orem being an idiot and having an inferiority complex. Hell, we barely know anything about Tennessee, played by Danny McBride, and he's probably the most entertaining character in the film. He likes bourbon. Wait, no, that's me. I like bourbon. In fact, I'm gonna need more whiskey to finish this fucking movie. Scratch that, he has a wife he presumably loves, and he likes John Denver. Side note, when the crew actually gets the transmission, it is Tennessee that identifies that the message is humming John Denver's Country Roads. It's a good scene, and a good character moment, and serves to dig a little deeper into Tennessee's inner life. We really could have used similar moments for the rest of the characters, especially Daniels and Oren. Oren comes off as such an unlikable piece of shit in this movie. I just felt like punching him every time he opened his mouth, and this comes from someone who writes a lot of asshole characters. It's Oren, now in command, who decides to head for the uncharted world where the transmission came from. Daniels protests, thinking it would be better to stay the course and adhere to their training, but Oren will not hear it, saying that this world seems to be habitable and Earth-like in a way that most worlds aren't, and it's a better target based on the data. And this serves as the motivation for getting the real story underway. There are no company directives to investigate the signal, and in fact, even though this is a Weyland-Yutani vessel, the company's harmful policies are far removed from this film. When they reach the planet, they find it surrounded by an ion storm of some sort, kind of like a magnetic hurricane on steroids. This leads to a scene that basically mimics Alien's descent to LV-426. The visuals, however, reveal an Earth-like world, and I don't know. Just because it's habitable doesn't mean it has to be exactly like Earth. I think if Giger were tasked with designing a habitable world that's hiding a terrible and deadly secret, I'd wager that he'd come up with something very different. The characters make mention that still water is not a good sign, but we never see anything truly strange. Something visual to tell us that these humans might not be as welcome as they think they are. I made mention in my video on experimental horror films that good weird fiction plays around with its description of environments, inviting in aspects of liminal spaces. Liminality in horror is used to create an uncanny valley effect that upsets us and tells us that the thing we're seeing is somehow off. This premise is often used well in cosmic horror by expressing an almost totally normal scene, save for the fact that the color of the sky is the wrong shade of blue. We should have gotten stuff like that in the landing sequence of this film. When the crew lands, they leave the shuttle without EVA suits. Even if initial data suggests the air is breathable, you still don't know if this transmission is a fucking warning. You don't know if anyone is alive or if something happened to them that could potentially put your crew in danger. No crew in their right minds would go virtually unprotected on an unknown world until there was extensive tests and scans done on the environment. They even find wheat growing at the base of the mountains and decide to investigate the source of the signal. Someone decides to go off and take a piss Jurassic Park style and steps on some weird fungal spheres that release the virus from Prometheus into his ear canal. The reveal of the space jockey style ship, I refuse to call it an engineer ship, from Prometheus could and should have been more eerie and impactful. For some reason, this reveal feels like an afterthought, and the compositions hardly capture the same presence and scale that the original film did. The second person to get infected runs up to some weird shit growing out of an alien spaceship and decides to poke it. Yeah, he deserves to die. Inside the alien ship, they find a fragmented message by accidentally activating the console. But the whole crew is called back to the shuttle when someone starts dying, leading to what I'm going to call the backburster scene. It's mostly alright effects-wise, though it is a little strange that the newborn protomorphs, I think that's what they're called at this stage, try to immediately attack something much larger than itself. Like, the chestburster didn't attack, it ran for a safe place to hide and mature to full size. A much more logical behavior even for an extremely aggressive predator. Whatever, the ship eventually blows up and Tennessee's wife dies. Oh, and this newborn protomorph dies because of its stupid pathfinding. Once Orin and his group returns, the guy who started poking strange fungi under an alien ship collapses and gets chest-burstered. Then a group of protomorphs attack. They fuck up Walter, ripping his hand off as he tries to defend the group while several redshirts die. Eventually, David saves them by lighting a flare and leading them back to quote-unquote safety. Safety, of course, is basically a graveyard that would fit in really nicely on a Terminator set. It's a courtyard of some kind, filled with petrified black corpses. And for what it's worth, the imagery here feels pretty good. Though I think they could have pushed the strangeness of the visuals more. David leads these people inside a large egg-shaped structure, and David explains that he's the last remaining part of the Prometheus' crew, that Shaw died, and blah blah blah. Orin explains he's got 2,000 colonists aboard the Covenant, and David gets a big creepy smile saying something like good little souls. One issue I have with these sets is that the architecture looks really Roman. I'm not saying that every alien world stuff should look like it came from the mind of H.R. Giger, but it would have been the right call for this film. Some of the visuals of the stone structures do look impressive, but I don't know. The interiors look pretty unremarkable. They could have been weirder. Anyway, David cuts his hair so he'll look more like Walter, setting up the big twist at the end. Eventually, the captain admits the obvious, that Daniels was right, and for some reason, Daniels tries to comfort him. This person whose name I didn't bother to learn, cause she's a redshirt, dies. Then David gives Walter a tour of his creature workshop, leading to the scene that really sours me on this film. The reveal that David is the creator of the version of the alien that we are familiar with in the first film. Now, there are those that say that David isn't creating the alien here, but recreating them. They use the metallic wall painting from Prometheus that kind of looks like our Xeno as evidence, but if that's the case, the film doesn't present us any evidence to support it. David will even claim that he created the perfect organism, leading to this stupid-ass scene where the first true chestburster that comes out of Captain Orin actually raises its hands to David like a puppet giving thanks and praise to its god. The idea that David is the one that creates the alien we know undermines Dan O'Bannon's original intent for these creatures to be like cicadas. You remember how they could hibernate for millions of years? It makes the world established in Alien feel small and serves to undermine the series' general themes. Remember how everyone always says you can't show too much of the monster? That it ruins the scare factor. This is what they actually mean when they say that. You're revealing too much about this monster. You're closing the mystery off in the viewer's head, thereby making them less of an unknown. The original Alien can be seen as both a hostile alien animal and a physical representation of the cosmic horror themes inherent in the film. This film wants to continue that tradition, but like the first prequel, doesn't understand what cosmic horror is even about. Both are ultimately just imitations, the worst kind of sequel. Anyway, TLDR, stop showing the goddamn monster so clearly. In the writing and visually. So Walter confronts David, leading David to say he created the perfect organism, and they get into a big fight with some fun android choreography. The fight doesn't end conclusively though. Oh no, oh gosh, who won? Give me a fucking drink. Side note, one pro I'll give this movie is that the props department nailed the body horror, with a lot of the taxonomy and Sean's mutilated, mutated, and somehow perfectly preserved after 10 years corpse. The alien kills a bunch of people, and Daniels and, surprise, Walter survive, and Tennessee gets close enough to the land for Daniels and Walter to get on board. But the alien manages to get aboard, and this leads to the dumbest action sequence in the film. Because as this platform is swinging Daniels around like a wrecking ball, she definitely would have slammed into something and died on impact. Humans are squishy. Somehow Daniels traps the alien in a giant claw machine grabber and pops it like a pimple. She doesn't get sprayed with acid due to the ship's acceleration. And then once we're back aboard the Covenant, we are treated to a literal recreation of the last half of the original Alien film, but less good. It's an action sequence where another xenomorph bursts onto the ship from some asshole who thought he got away from a facehugger that was like, nah, just kidding, you're pregnant, I'ma die now. There are also these weird sequences where we see inside the alien's head for some stupid fucking reason. The problem with this is that it ruins the suspense by putting you into the creature's shoes, when you should be relating to the characters who are risking their lives in the face of this unknown threat. In the past, I've praised the voyeuristic way Alien was shot, and while on the surface this might feel like the next logical step to that, it's a step too far into the realm of the ridiculous. It feels more video gamey than anything else, like you're in the middle of an Evolve match. Does anyone remember that game? I guess Evil Dead does that too, right? Or does it? I can't remember. Anyway, Walter guides Daniels and Tennessee into cornering the thing in the cargo bay, and they manage to blow it out of an airlock by literally running it through with a forklift. Blow it out in an airlock, it's the only way to be sure. Once everyone's safe, Daniels patches up her android pal, and she and Tennessee bed down for the long sleep. Only for Daniels to realize Walter is actually David after all, as she's put into suspended animation. Done, done, done. David removes 2 facehugger-shaped embryo things and puts them in cold storage or whatever, and the movie ends. Alien Covenant is a frustrating film. It wants to have its cake and eat it too, trying to play it safe by giving people what they want and be a sequel to Prometheus at the same time. It feels like a fucking mess, frankly. But it's not competent enough to really unify its themes. Don't get me wrong, the film's premise has promise. The idea of a colony ship stumbling upon an ancient civilization that has something to do with the mythos surrounding the xenomorphs sounds like a cool film. But the execution and the fact that David plays Space Daddy to the perfect organism ruins any goodwill it tries to establish through tone or visuals. Okay, we finally made it. And now that we've covered both of these films, it's time for me to drink until I suppress the memory of ever having rewatched them. Yeah, that sounds right. In the next video in this series, I'm going to explain how I would rewrite both Prometheus and Covenant. And trust me, there are some wild fucking ideas in that script. I can't wait for you to see it and all the Gigarian artwork I've got planned for it. But until then, check out the original Alien video essay as well as my review and mini essay on Alien Romulus, linked in the comments and description. I'm Eric Malikyte, and I'll see you next time, Space Cowboy.